Welcome to the Virtual Door Knocking in 2020 podcast. Today with my guest, Harvey Deutschendorf, we will be discussing the power of the podcast and how it applies to our present situation, campaigning and running for public office. So Harvey, before we get started here, why don't you give the audience a little bit of information about you and your expertise with EI?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Harvey Deutschendorf, and I'm a expert on emotional intelligence, and I have a book called The Other Kind of Smart, Simple Ways to Boost Your Emotional Intelligence for Greater Personal Effectiveness and Success. And that's been internationally published. And I speak on emotional intelligence, and that's my basically my passion and my forte in life. So really looking forward to speaking about it today.
Good. Well, thank you for being on the show. And so because of the COVID-19 pandemic and everything going on, we have so many restrictions. And so the old way of campaigning, the door knocking, the shaking hands and kissing babies is no longer allowed. And so most of the candidates who are running are going to have to deliver their message through some type of virtual means. And so today we're going to be talking about the power of the podcast. And so Harvey, why don't we, before we get started, why don't you give the audience really an understanding, what is emotional intelligence?
Emotional intelligence is our ability to recognize, to differentiate our and manage our emotions and the emotions of others around us. And this is really becomes important when candidates are podcasting or they're having virtual meetings, because we have to be able to manage, first of all, our emotions and have to emotionally connect with our audience.
So we've probably all seen countless times the presidential campaign debates that they have on television, where you have 10 candidates up on the stage, and sooner or later, someone's going to get under the skin of the other one, and before you know it, their emotional intelligence, as you just described it, has just gone down the toilet. It's really just been flushed. So how can a candidate trying to deliver their message and potentially be in a virtual debate, how can they use emotional intelligence to really not only win the debate, but really win over the audience?
Well, I think in a virtual debate like that, the candidate who controls their emotions wins. If the other candidate gets upset and starts to attack them, make remarks, and the person can remain cool and calm and take it with a sense of humor and just get their message out there and not be thrown off their message. What happens is a lot of times when candidates are attacked, they will get off their message and forget about it. And so candidate can stay on the message, will win the debate. How to stay on that message is not to know what your triggers are, and when you are attacked, be able to keep your emotions under control and be able to stick to your message and not get rattled and not get drawn into the conflict, whatever the other candidate is trying to draw you into, to draw you off your message.
Okay. So, but how can a candidate really connect emotionally through using a podcast? What tips can you give them?
Yeah, first of all, candidates need to understand that people make decisions. We all think we're rational beings, but we're actually emotional beings, and people will make their decision on a candidate really based at an emotional level, and then they will rationalize it and justify it by talking about the candidate's platform, their ideas, and things like that. So what candidates need to do is make strong connections with their audience, with the constituents. And one of the ways of doing that is, instead of talking about issues, throwing out facts and figures, is to talk about issues at a level that affects people. I'll give an example. I heard Obama, when he was campaigning, talking about healthcare. It's a broad issue. You could talk about facts and figures, how many Americans are uninsured, that type of thing. But he didn't talk about that. He spoke about a person, I think her name was Sally, and she lived in Montana. She had a face, she had a name, a place, and she had cancer, and she was unable to, because she had a pre-existing condition, was unable to get health care. Now, people can relate to that. They'll think about that. They'll think about somebody in their own family. That story will resonate with people, or if you just talked about the issues, it would not connect to most people. Now, the other thing, a good way to connect with people is through telling stories. When we tell people, give them just information, our brains actually decode the information into a way that becomes meaningful. Now, telling stories are a much more powerful way of connecting, because the brain actually, more of the brain is involved, because when we hear a story, we are trying to activate the story, what we're being told, in ways that make sense to us, ways that we can actually relate to. So, if a story is told in a way that we can relate to, we become synchronized with the person actually telling the story, and we form, and that way we form an emotional connection. So there's a couple rules to when you're telling a story. First of all, we need to keep the story within the audience's experience. Stories that are good stories are stories that the audience can relate to. Know your audience, know how they live. So you're not telling stories that they don't know anything about. So a good story is one that actually talks about something that is near and dear to your audience. For example, you could, you talk about something that they can relate to. Stories that are really, really good are gold. If people can bring in something about children, something, dogs, most people like dogs, those stories are really, really gold. Now, the thing to keep in mind about stories is that the purpose of the story is really to connect. So you look for opportunities for issues that are going on in your community to tell a story. It's not just about talking about yourself, because people will get tired of that very quickly, but relate the story to something that is going on, something that affects people, and that affects them at a very, very deep level. The stories right now that you tell would be one about COVID-19 and how it's affected their families, the fears that they have around COVID-19, stories around their financial struggles. Businesses are having to stay open. We talk about, I talked to somebody who was struggling with such and such, and somebody that you could talk about your family, your own struggles, talk about things that you've struggled with, that you've overcome, that people could relate to because they've struggled with the same sort of things. Be passionate if you can. If that's you, be very, very passionate. For example, Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream." It wouldn't have had the same impact if he would have said, "Well, I sort of have this idea in the back of my mind," but only do that if that's you, if you have that passion. That will connect deeply with people at an emotional level. Now, the other thing that we can do is that we can show emotion. I remember going to a workshop. I went to many workshops with this man who talked to us about him and his brother. They had a business they had started, and how they almost lost the business. And when he was telling the story, when he was talking about the part where it was really, really looking very, very bad, tears would come to his eyes. And now the reason he told this wasn't just to tell his story, because he was talking to entrepreneurs. We're all entrepreneurs in there, and we could relate to that story, because as entrepreneurs, many of us has been in that situation, where finances have been tight. We've been in all desperate situations. That's the reason he told the story, and that's why it resonated. It wasn't just because he was telling a story. He tied it into our world, what our world looked like. The other thing is to tell stories that people can really relate to. If you're talking to, if your audience, your constituents are middle class, working class people, don't tell stories about your country house or time you spent on your yacht. Tell stories that these people can relate to. Talk about, you went fishing to the local lake or whatever, or something that you did. You went to the baseball game, what your local team is playing. Tell stories that everybody can relate to, that will connect with these people. Of course, if you're telling a story and you get some emotion, is okay. So getting back to the story I was telling about the man whose workshops I've taken, he showed some emotion, and he started to tear up, but he didn't let himself go. He was able to manage that. It wouldn't have helped if he was able to just go gushing out, let his emotions, start wailing and crying and that. So share emotions, but show that you're still in control of the emotions. Your audience will really, really appreciate that. So, yeah.
I think this is great advice, and really staying in control. Harvey, I can't thank you enough for sharing these tidbits of great advice. If someone that's running for candidacy wants to reach out and get some additional coaching, how can they reach out to you?
Well, I'm at the harvey.ei guy at shaw.ca, or they can reach me. My website is theotherkindofsmart.com. It's the same as the title of the book,
Okay.
theotherkindofsmart.com, if you remember that. They can just reach out to me, and I would be happy to help them out. Yeah,
I think you could give everybody some great advice there, because you've now inspired me, because I think I'm going to go from this podcast and I'm going to start my own podcast, and I'm going to call it the Everyone Has a Story podcast, and I'm going to tell stories throughout the entire podcast. I think I can do that.
I think so. I think that's a great idea. Stories are very, very powerful, and they have been since the beginning of time. They're the most powerful forms of communication that we actually have.
So when I start that podcast, Harvey, you're going to come back and you're going to be my guest, and you're going to tell people why my message is so strong, because I'm telling stories and I'm trying to tie into their EI.
That's wonderful. I'd love to.
Great. All right. Well, Harvey, thank you very much for your time. And then I will be speaking with you a little bit later tonight.
Okay. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Harvey.
Bye now.